Hello everybody and welcome back to Spacedock. I'm SOJOURN and today we're looking at dropships or landing craft or whatever you want to call them. These are an extension of the role of the transport helicopter into sci-fi with the extra kick of dropping from orbit to deliver their cargo because it's just cool. Naturally, there's a lot of crossover in this role with many other craft like shuttles, transports and helicopters because a dropship is just all of those mixed together and super optimized for the task of going between space and a planet's surface. Those other craft, particularly the shuttles, also have a good chance of being much more civilian-minded in design, meant to go between two highly safe and secure locations. Dropships are different because they're intended to be operated near or directly on a battlefield, which is why they're more similar to helicopters than planes, since choppers can get so much closer to the action. Think of the Huey in Vietnam, going into jungle clearings to extract people while under fire, that sort of thing. The opposite route is to be extremely stealthy, taking in troops, supplies or whatever without even being seen, and the natural ally of stealth is electronic warfare, but that's already a rarity to see in fiction as is, let alone being applied to something specific like a dropship. Whether or not the sneaky approach is appropriate also depends on what you're fighting. I don't think stealth tech is terribly handy against swarms of giant bugs, so going loud and shooting them to clear out a landing area is the better option. Let's look at the requirements a dropship needs to meet to do its job, starting with atmospheric entry, which is the whole point of a dropship in the first place. Now, entering atmospheres can get a bit spicy depending on velocity, but that's much less of a concern with the straight down drops that most sci-fi goes with. But still, it's worth pointing out for settings that go with a more realistic atmospheric entry at shallower angles and orbital speeds. The other side of this is that a dropship has to be able to function in both space and atmosphere, so it has to be able to seal against a vacuum and have engines and control systems that work in both flight regimes. And since these craft are meant to emulate helicopters, the engines also have to be able to let the craft hover and land and take off vertically. This can be achieved in many ways, from having special landing engines to rotating ones or mixes of all kinds of propulsion. On top of this, reaction control systems for realistic spaceflight also come in very handy for hovering flight in atmospheres, and have been used in real VTOL jets. Of course, none of this matters if a setting has magic hover tech, since you can just use that, letting the engines be totally out of the way of the doors or ramps or whatever is used to load and unload the craft. Which is another big concern because, well, you gotta transfer troops or cargo in or out of the craft in a safe and timely manner, because if you're dropping into a hot landing zone, you gotta get things done as quickly as possible. Do the sides open up and everyone jumps out? Is there a nice flat ramp at the rear? What about the entire underside of the ship lowering flush with the ground? Whatever the design is, the access has to be out of the way of the engines, and depending on placement, can allow the ship to do cool things like pinnacle landings on cliffs and rooftops. Seriously, look how cool these Chinooks are doing pinnacles. Give me more of a sick dropship doing a pickup like that. Though if you think about it, a dropship might not even need to land at all. Obviously this is situation dependent, but helicopters can deploy troops using fast ropes, and sci-fi has things like jetpacks and such to make drops even easier than that. Or even anti-grav tech to get even easier, something put to good use by the Covenant. Or perhaps it just drops off a cargo module or something, which seems pretty close to what the Starship Troopers ones were meant to do with that giant box they carry. It looks like they're set up kinda like Thunderbird 2, with the potential to carry all sorts of different things in those big boxes, from troops to supplies or even vehicles. I want to highlight that last one because there's a particular subtype of dropship designed around transporting vehicles, and these do things very differently to the way that's done in real life. In boring reality, airdrops are done only with lightweight vehicles, and likely ones that have been packaged up and pushed out the back of a cargo plane to land safely with parachutes, or even more boringly, just driven out of them after landing. Fiction does things very differently, with combat-ready, fully crewed vehicles deposited directly into battle, or at least nearby to one. Which is kinda crazy, but that's what you can do with fiction, like being able to airdrop full-size tanks, or bigger. Usually because vehicles are bigger, they need bigger dropships to carry them, like the special Heavy Pelican that delivers mechs for you in Helldivers, but occasionally there are hybrid dropships that can do both, like Halo's Pelican or the UD-4 Cheyenne from Aliens. This is the dropship. It's true that James Cameron didn't invent the concept, but the Cheyenne absolutely solidified what one was in the public consciousness. This was where the helicopter analogue really comes from, with the earliest concepts being based on the AH-64. Vietnam War era references were added to the final design, like the F-14 shoulders. See, this was why I mentioned the Huey at the start. The Cheyenne is a design that holds up for a reason as well. It's not just up there out of nostalgia. It very literally fits the drop definition. It's got an aviator-wearing pilot who says cool things.
We're in the pipe, 5 by 5.
It's extremely heavily armed with all the rockets and missiles and guns you could ever want. Can be remotely piloted, and it carries the equally awesome APC, which barrels out at top speed when deployed. What's not to love? A similar APC carrying craft is the Skycrane-inspired LAAT-C, though since this is low altitude, it kind of filters itself out from being a dropship. But really, if we look at Star Wars at large, it kinda does its own thing, because there's very little difference between atmospheric and spaceflight in the setting, meaning general-purpose armed transports can do both roles with ease. Dropships instead seem to be more of a thing for getting large vehicles down to surfaces, like the Y-85, but then that job can be done by smaller, multi-role ships like the Gozanti as well. Star Wars also has a couple of great examples of really large-scale landing craft, like the Acclimator and C-9979, which really stretch the already thin definition of dropship due to their size. It's worth mentioning the upper limit of this type of craft though, since such things show up in other settings as well, most notably the Heron from Halo Wars. The things in Dune kinda meet this, though they're definitely just armed and shielded transports. Which brings us back to the design requirements of a dropship, specifically its defensive and offensive capabilities. Defensive measures are clearly important on a dropship since it needs to protect its precious cargo, but many dropships are either not in settings with stuff like shield tech or are just too small. Instead, they broadly make use of speed to get in and out before being engaged, and it's a good idea to supplement this with standard countermeasures like flares and the like, or use electronic warfare and stealth. The last consideration is whether or not to slap some guns on the thing. Even something small like a crew-operated machine gun to provide suppressive fire is good enough. You don't need the country-flattening payload of a Cheyenne for everything. Though dropships with heavy firepower like that can also hang around and provide close air support to those it drops off, which does make a degree of sense. The whole vibe of a dropship is to fall into hostile territory where support might be lacking, so packing guns on them to clear a place out or to defend themselves against attack is a good idea. Or perhaps they're just designed to be multi-role, or are taking inspiration from a real-life multi-role aircraft. Another way to go that's a lot rarer to see is to have a variant of a dropship that forgoes its troop capacity in favour of a heavier armament, in much the same vein as the MH-60L direct action penetrator. These craft go in with the normal transports to support them, with the obvious fictional example here being the Assault Raptor from BSG. Dropships. A very specific type of craft that has a ton of overlap with many other transports, and as such, the relevancy of the term itself strongly depends on the setting. There's lots of important design considerations due to the specificity of their role, but equally that means plenty of choices to make, including many cool sci-fi ways of spicing them up. But really, the best thing about them is the simplest. They drop from orbit, which automatically makes them one of the coolest vehicle types in fiction. You can support Spacedock by joining our Patreon, where you can get our frigate and spacefighter design reference books. Alternatively, you can support us directly through YouTube by becoming a channel member. Thanks to our supporters, and thank you for watching.